good day, because good afternoon would be half greeting from our side, because it's morning for some of ours and afternoon for others. Good day for all the participants of our webinar, What to Expect at the Financing for Development Conference and Beyond. My name is András Törényi from the Global Cities Hub, and I will be the moderator of this event. I will like to ask 2 or 3 minutes of patience from our speakers and from those who has already joined, to wait others joining as we just opened the webinar for all the participants. So we will start in 2 minutes sharp. Thank you. So while I see that some others are joining, I suggest we jump in and start our discussion. Please be aware that this webinar is recorded, and it is done so to be able to vision it on our YouTube channel later on for all those who cannot join us today. First of all, let me welcome all our audience. We are very happy to provide this webinar with 2 great speakers, 2 great experts from 2 different hemispheres of the world. We have with us Karen Hitschke and Mauricio Rodas. Welcome, Karen. Welcome, Mauricio. Thank you very much for accepting our invitation. The program will be very straightforward. I will give you a short introduction of our speakers and a short introduction of the Financing for Development Conference to set the frame. And I will go directly after that to our 2 speakers to share their vision and their experience with us. Once at the conference, I heard the speaker thanking the moderator who said, "Thanks for the long introduction. It proves how old I am." Since then, I tried to keep my points very, very short. So Karen, Mauricio, allow me not to read all your bios, but to pick a couple of points for our audience, which explains why we are very happy at the Global Cities Hub to have you on board with us. Karen Hitschke is the CEO of Building Bridges Foundation, which connects stakeholders across sectors to drive sustainable finance solutions and promote investment that create positive environmental and social impact. So she will have this view of the social and environment impact and the business sector and the public sector as well. But she will also can bring us a view from the international organizations, because she is former COO of the World Health Organization Foundation. And I think it's very important that we have these 2 aspects incorporated in one speaker. She's also board member, co-founder, and former managing director at Yunus Social Business Global Initiatives, an impact investing organization funding social businesses. And I will be very honest, I'm curious how you see the impact investment question at the local level, we will come back to it later. I am also very happy to have with us Mauricio Rodas, who is head of the Secretariat of the SDSN Urban Commission. I think that title would be enough already to have you as a speaker, but you are also former mayor of Quito in Ecuador. And our goal here at the Global Cities Hub is really to bring together the local, the national, and the international level. And you are one of those who has this experience. You are also a world co-president of UCLG. You served as member of the board of the Global Covenant of Mayors, C40 Cities Climate Leadership Group, and the International Council for Local Environmental Initiatives. And even more, you worked with the UN Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean in Santiago de Chile and in Mexico City. So you are a perfect candidate to tell us your experience from the different levels. And I am very eager to hear both of you and having with us. Thank you. Very briefly, to set the frame about the Financing for Development conferences for our audience who might not be absolutely familiar with all the details. These are conferences aimed to address key financial and related issues for global development, with each building upon the updating the previous agreements to tackle evolving challenges. The first Financing for Development conference was in Monterrey in 2002, so we are talking about a quite long process. 2008 in Doha, 2015 in Addis Ababa, and this year, in 2 weeks, we will have the fourth international conference in Sevilla. And this upcoming conference will focus on the urgent financing challenges hindering the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals. We all know that there is an international acknowledgement since the Summit of the Future that localizing SDGs is very, very important to have the chance to achieve them. And I believe that the Financing for Development conference will have a big role this year to discuss the financing of the localization of the SDGs. And it is one of the main points I would like you to elaborate on with us. The conference will talk about debt and development crisis, domestic resource mobilization, private financing and public-private financing, the international development cooperation, and financing the relaunch of the SDGs, as I mentioned earlier. The Global Cities Hub will have the pleasure to be in Sevilla and talk at a panel with mayors. We are very happy that not only member states representatives, international financial organization representatives, but also local government representatives will be present. And at this panel, we will talk about the mayor's declaration on financing for development for a better future, which recommends states to bring in the local level and strengthen cooperation on the future of the financial architecture between the international, the national, and the local levels. But I will perhaps come back to that after your presentations, because first and foremost, I would like to hear from you, Karen, and you, Mauricio, how you see these questions and how you see the localizing financing through strengthening cooperation and the role of collaboration between the public and the private sector to advance urban development in a sustainable and resilient manner. Karen, if we can start with you perhaps, and then Mauricio, please, the floor is yours.
Wonderful. Well, first of all, thanks so much for setting it up, for giving us the opportunity to share our experience here. And let me maybe start also with collaboration and building bridges. In fact, collaboration is very much at the heart of building bridges. Building bridges was established in 2019 here, in fact, in Geneva, literally because it was building bridges between the right and the left side of the Rhone, where on the right side we have, in fact, the public sector, the international organizations, the NGOs, but also United Nations organizations. And on the left side of the Rhone, you have the private sector. So especially in Switzerland, as you're probably very aware of, the financial sector very strongly, trading companies. So basically bringing that for-profit, private world together with the non-profit world. So this was really the purpose why Building Bridges was established. How can we catalyze basically that collaboration to really mobilize private and public investments at scale towards the SDGs, towards sustainability and basically also social goals. That is something, especially we know we need trillions to finance that. The private sector is usually the one that is, let's say, that is in a way expected to do more, but lagging behind, but not lagging behind because not willing to, but because there's a lack of collaboration between the different stakeholders. So this is what Building Bridges is doing. We are fostering that multi-stakeholder engagement. At the core of the organization, we have the public sector as founding partners, from the city to the Swiss Confederation, policymakers, multilateral development banks, UN bodies, but then also the private sector, the banking sector, and so on. We do this in different ways. On one hand, we have an annual flagship conference that we run every year here in Geneva. That's great, I'm getting a call at the same time. And this is, so it's happening this year from the 3rd of September to the 2nd of October. It's a three-day conference. And in fact, it's it does showcase, has more than 2,000 participants, from 50% from the for-profit sector, 50% from the private sector. And it really showcases that collaboration in different events, very interactive events, to really foster how the different sectors understand each other. That is the most important one. What we feel is that why is the collaboration lagging? Because these sectors think very differently, they act very differently. And the first step, they need to understand their mutual, let's say, incentives and also constraints in order to be able to see how we can really build an ecosystem that works together to really mobilize those fundings. Throughout the year, as a foundation, we also foster small-scale events where we basically bring the right people, the right stakeholders together to really work on very specific problems where we know that you have to deep dive and have an open discussion about critical issues that sometimes are hard to tackle in the public space, let's say. Now, as we approach the CVE and the 4th International Conference on Financing Development, we know we are not there. There are a lot is at stake. We're only 5 years away from 2030 when we're supposed to achieve the SDGs, and we all know we are not there, neither on the climate risk nor on the social goals. We have already the climate effects. We see that communities are affected of that, and the fiscal space communities have and nations have is really limited. And that is really why things have to change and accelerate significantly. The local financing is so important because we have the global goals, and there's been a lot of progress on also having the national contributions being defined. But how does it then come down to the local level, and how does it break down? How do we get the financing there? And that is really where we still need to connect the dots, because the solutions need to be implemented where the people live, and that is in the cities, in the communities. So how do we really make that connection from the national, let's say the global space to the national level, to the local level then, so implementation can really happen. In the cities, and this is I think why we're also today focusing on the urban development here in this thing, the cities are so important because now 6% of the population live there. That's going to increase to 75% of the world population in 2050. That's the projections at the moment. And although cities only occupy 3% of land, they produce more than 60% of CO2 emissions. They consume more than 70% of the global energy. So this is really where change needs to happen. If we don't address urban development, we don't address the cities, we are not really tackling the issues. And this is, I think, where the collaboration needs to happen, the local empowerment needs to happen. We need to make sure we connect the dots from a global agenda that's overarching really to a very granular level where we empower and engage the local communities. And I halt here. So I can hand over to Mauricio, who in fact has exactly that experience, obviously. And yeah, and then we can follow on after that with additional questions. You're on mute, Andres.
Yes, thank you very much. I totally agree. City level brings us to Mauricio based on your previous experience, but also your current experience working with cities. So please, Mauricio, go on.
Thank you so much, Andres. Thank you for this kind invitation to be part of the conversation. And also, I'm very happy to share this space with Karen. Let me first tell you a little bit about the SDSN Global Commission for Urban SDG Finance. This commission is formed by 80 plus mayors from around the world, leaders from different city networks, so C40, UCLG, ECLAY, the Global Covenant of Mayors, the Resilient Cities Network. We also have representatives from international finance institutions, international organizations, different UN agencies, also the OECD, many representatives from NGOs and the private sector. And the aim of the commission is to explore and advocate for innovative financial mechanisms for cities to implement the SDGs. We all know that cities play a pivotal role in implementing the global agendas. Karen just mentioned the importance of cities in terms of GDP, in terms of energy consumption, in terms of CO2 generation, but also in terms of the percentage of the global population that now live in cities and will be a percentage that will be increasing even more over the next few decades. So the first point I want to make is without cities, without an effective role from cities, it will be impossible to meet the goals of the SDGs, of the Paris Agreement, of the New Urban Agenda, and many other global agendas. Unfortunately, for cities to play that effective role, obviously they need access to finance, and they are having a very hard time trying to do so because they are confronting a country-focused global financial architecture. The current global financial architecture was designed back in the 1940s under Bretton Woods, when the world was not nearly as urbanized as it is today. Now things have changed. We live in a different reality in which cities are at the driver's seat of many of the things happening around the world. Cities are actually at the forefront of dealing with some of the world's most pressing issues. And they, of course, cannot do so effectively without proper access to resources within what is still today a nation-centric international financial system. And let me just share some facts about how the current system is so much country-focused. To start with, only 44% of countries in the world allow cities to borrow. That means that in the other 56% of countries, cities are proscribed from borrowing. Less than 10% of the total amount of climate finance around the world are going into cities right now. Less than 10%. Cities around the world face several challenges in terms of fiscal capacity, in terms of, in many cases, arbitrarily imposed low debt limits. They also face a lack of capacity to properly raise revenue, a lack of clarity on, where can they have access from. So there's an issue regarding regulatory frameworks all over the world, but particularly in the global south, that are preventing cities from properly access to finance. And then if you look at what's going on, in these cities, then you realize that clearly vertical integration, multi-level government collaboration is needed. Last week, I was in South Africa speaking to the African Mayors Assembly on this particular issue. And you could hear all sorts of really concerning stories about the lack of ability of cities to actually manage their own finances, how dependent they are on government transfers that very frequently, because of political reasons, are delayed, which is, affecting the way cities plan their service delivery and therefore the possibility of addressing citizens' needs. If you look at the other axis of this equation, which is international finance, then you realize that because of the way the different international financial institutions, for example, the multilateral development banks, are governed, they don't have an incentive to channel directly funds to cities. MDBs are governed by national governments. When you look at their boards, you see National Ministry of Finance being there. So, of course, they don't want to lose control on how the money is channeled and allocated in their respective countries. And the problem is that very frequently, the way the money is allocated internally in their countries is following political criteria rather than technical one. So I think that there's a huge need for developing new direct financial facilities for cities coming from MDBs. And then the other very important axis, which Karen already mentioned, is the private sector. We all understand that public money will never be enough to finance the approximately $4.3 trillion needed to turn the current urban infrastructure into a climate resilient one per year. So we need private sector money. But the problem is that in many countries, particularly in the global south, regulatory frameworks are extremely complex and difficult to implement to attract private sector investment. There's a huge need for developing spaces for mutual understanding between city officials and the private sector, because for the most part, the private sector has been used to deal directly with national governments, not local ones. So I think it's very important to engage the private sector from the early stages of the project cycle in order to kind of co-create projects that would later become attractive for private sector investment. Finally, I think the Finance for Development Conference in Seville can turn into a very interesting opportunity to push for the necessary reforms to the international financial system to make it more cities-friendly, to address the different needs from local governments. Unfortunately, from what we can see now, and after looking at the outcome document, the outcome draft document for the conference, for example, the word urban is not mentioned even once throughout the document. There are very few mentions to subnational governments. There are very few mentions to local governments. So I think that's very concerning. But of course, we cannot let ourselves become frustrated. We have to go to Seville with high spirits and with a lot of optimism to push forward the agenda of subnational finance. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mauricio. Thank you for your insights. I think the numbers talk for themselves. The 44 member states you mentioned who allows the 44% of member states who allows cities to borrow, but also the fact that the whole system, as you said, was created in a different historic era, and I believe, or I hope, that this year, which is the 80th anniversary of the UN, is also an opportunity to really have these serious discussions about how to make it more efficient and how to make it more inclusive in the sense that the different levels of government can participate. And I share your optimism that the FFD 4 will be an opportunity to push for this agenda. I would like to open the floor for our audience as well. Please use the chat if you have any questions and comments. And while the first questions will arrive in the chat, let me elaborate on what I have already mentioned, that in Sevilla, we will present the Mayor's Declaration on Financing for Development, which is administered by the Global Parliament of Mayors and the Global Cities Hub. And this declaration calls for a greater collaboration between LRGs, national governments, and IFIs. And I'm really happy that I heard most of the points from you, Mauricio, which reflects our intention on inclusive multilateralism in the financial architecture, better political commitment to sustainable resource allocation for climate resilience at the local level, the reform of the MDBs to include climate financing at the local level, and I would like to come back to that point, but also the investment in the net zero technologies and public-private partnerships, etc. Let me come back to you, Karan, because you mentioned in your introductory remarks the intersectoral aspect of your work. And it was also mentioned that the multi-level and multilateral cooperation is very important. How do you see these different angles? How can you bridge these different angles in your experience, in your work for promoting sustainability and climate resilience?
So I think, so as you said, there are two levels. One is how do we get the different sectors to work together, so the public and the private sector, and then the other is the different, as you say, the national, the global level, then connecting with the regional and the local level. And maybe I'll just address both. I think so there are a lot of the financing mechanisms that are, let's say, that are moving funds or investments towards also towards the developing world, if I can comprehensively call it that way, are basically often a mix of private and public funding. In order to get more private funding in, we need to leverage the public funding available, because one, there's not enough, and this is the only way to mobilize private investments and to de-risk. So I think a lot of these mechanisms, like catalytic funding, where foundation comes in, foundations, philanthropic money, or also public money that kind of de-risks private investments, requires obviously collaboration. The question about guarantee funds or guarantees by insurance companies, for example, or country insurance, or at a lower level, that reduce the risk for private investments are necessary, but always you have to, that requires obviously the collaboration. Public-private partnerships is a classical example, blended finance, where you do have different, let's say, different tranches of public funding, also sometimes philanthropic funding, that take a first loss stake and then basically absorb the losses or the risk, and enable private investments to come in and lower their risk, and therefore also do proper investments. That requires obviously that these different players work together. And then we have the third element, that's the policy making. Private investment really requires transparency, good governance, and also stability and regulation. It requires clear rules, because these are long-term investments, especially when we talk about infrastructure. Those are not short-term investments, they are over several years. So that kind of stability is really important for private investors. And this is where the public sector comes in, and not just through finance, but really through clear policies, clear regulation, good governance to avoid corruption, which is something that doesn't happen everywhere, but it's important for private investors to see that is happening. And this needs to be properly packaged, properly implemented, and only then you will be able to mobilize more private investments. So I think this is where I would say the different stakeholders, the different parties really need to work together and collaborate to move private investments. The other thing is when I see, so if we want to change things at a large scale, you need to move a lot of money. The problem is where do the big amounts come from? They come from institutional investors. There's a whole regulatory element about prudential regulation. We can talk about that separately or at a later stage. But how do we move big amounts of money into a local level. There's let's say these projects or investments that are happening in maybe in urban development on a local level are often relatively small scale for an institutional investor who needs to bring in a lot, basically big investments on the road. So how do we create a pipeline and a fund that brings together a portfolio of different, let's say, projects that one, diversify risk, but on the other hand, then also enable larger investments that satisfy the development banks, but also the private investors at scale. And this is really where, and there's a disconnect, I would say, between where the money comes from and understanding the local level. And I've seen that you were referring, Andras, to my work at Social Business, when we are really investing in local entrepreneurs. And there's a huge disconnect also with the multilateral banks to see what is really happening at a local level. They often interact with large-scale projects or with national level, maybe regional, but then coming to cities is something where you have quite a disconnect. And I think, how do we bridge that huge gap on those different levels? I think that is a challenge. I think that's been also addressed here by Mauricio already.
Thank you, Karen. I would come back to the financial regulation part you just mentioned, but Mauricio, would you have any comment on that question? How to diversify risk, how to advance financing instruments, catalytic financing, blended financing, guarantee funds, your work, the SDSN on those. And also in the chat, there's one question concerning the capacity at the local level to run big projects if financing is coming. If you have any experience with that, Mauricio, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you. Let me take the first part of the question, and then we'll speak about the other one. So in the Commission, we're exploring different mechanisms that could enhance cities' access to finance. One very concrete initiative in which we're working now is the creation of the Green Cities Guarantees Fund. As mentioned before, given this country-focused global financial architecture that cities are navigating in, one of the problems in those 44% of countries of the world in which cities are allowed to borrow is that in many of those cities, yes, they can borrow, but they need a national sovereign guarantee. For example, here in Ecuador, when I was mayor of Quito, and I built, the city built the first metro line in the country, we got funding from 4 multilateral development banks. But we needed a national sovereign guarantee. A national sovereign guarantee that the government didn't want to give us because of political rivalries. And it was very challenging. We have to mobilize public opinion support in favor of the project to put political pressure on the national government, who ended up giving us the guarantee. But that's the kind of thing that mayors shouldn't go through. Mayors shouldn't go through this ordeal just to do the right thing and to undertake climate resilient infrastructure projects. And unfortunately, this is the kind of thing that is happening in many cities around the world. So to come up with an alternative guarantee mechanism to the highly politicized one of the sovereign guarantees is that we are launching this Green Cities Guarantees Fund, which will not only become an alternative to the sovereign guarantee, but also will become a city-dedicated guarantees facility that would allow cities to access timely and affordable borrowing. Because one of the problems that cities are facing right now is the perceived risk of dealing with cities. And I highlight the word perceived, because when you actually look at the data, there's no really reason to have such a risk perception of dealing with cities. Let me give you a fact on this. We have spoken with people in the finance industry, in the insurance industry, in the guarantees industry, and they all say that the problem about dealing with cities is that there's a high perception of political risk, stability risk of dealing with them. But we went actually to look at the data, and we compared the data from a big study that the European Investment Bank developed to compare default rates between the private sector and local governments for the last 20-something years. And it turned out that the default rate from the private sector is much higher than those of the local government. So there's not really a reason why to think about cities as risky. But unfortunately, that's the way it is. That's reality. So in order to address the risk problem, I think these guarantees can play a very important role to de-risk these operations and to therefore attract more private sector investment into cities, but also to allow cities to access funds coming from different international financing institutions that usually ask for this kind of guarantees to provide resources for cities to develop critically important climate resilient infrastructure. The way we have thought about the Green Cities Guarantees Fund is for it to support cities directly when cities are allowed to access finance, but also to support, for example, municipally owned utility companies, which can become very handy when cities cannot access finance directly, but they can do so through their utilities, or even supporting projects developed by the private sector investing in urban initiatives. So in this way, the Green Cities Guarantees Fund could support many cities around the world, regardless of their different regulatory framework realities. And I think that, this is the kind of initiatives that we should be discussing, very practically oriented, addressing real life problems from cities when accessing finance. Going very quickly to the second part of the question. Yes, it is true that in many cities around the world, there's a lack of capacity to undertake big infrastructure projects, even when the finance is available. And that's something that we need to address. And we need to address that, in my view, by fostering new and more effective technical assistance mechanisms that should be tied to these financing tools that are being developed or that are being discussed. So the technical assistance component is fundamental. And not only to develop the capacity of cities to implement these projects, but also to develop the technical capacity cities need in order to design, to develop bankable projects, to develop projects that would be attractive for investment. So I definitely think that there's a lot to do in this regard, also in terms of strengthening cities' credit worthiness levels. It is very concerning that if you take according to the World Bank, if you take the 500 largest cities in the developing world, only 20% of them are deemed credit worthy. And we're looking at the 500 largest cities. Can you imagine what the situation of the medium-sized and small cities is? Probably much worse. So credit worthiness, financial stability is something that should be strengthened, and therefore technical assistance can become really helpful to do so.
Maybe if I can just add to that, Andres, if you allow me. So Brazil has just launched the Green Resilient Model Cities program. And I mean, Mauricio, you're probably much more aware than I am on that, but one of the core elements of that is really that technical assistance to really enable cities to execute. So it is, of course, it's managing a pipeline, creating a pipeline, getting the funding in, but then accompanied with technology, with technical support to really properly plan and implement what is being financed, so that it really becomes attractive also for private investors, and something where you have that, where you reduce the risk of also not just regulatory risk, governance risk, things like that, integrity, but then really the execution risk, the implementation risk that you are bound to have. And I think that is very promising, as you say, Mauricio, to say, how do you really link that together? And as far as I understand, they've picked 50 pilot cities in a way in order to get that started. And I think it's a great blueprint in order that could then really be scaled up to see how do we replicate that and make that the standard model of financing, where we say, one, you can demonstrate that it does reduce the risk if you have the right package together. And that then allows you, if you can collect that data, also about the risk from that, or the reduction of the risk through that approach, then you can really start scaling it up and replicate that. And that will provide a much better incentive for private investors, and obviously also for multilateral banks, to really then come in, because they see the real risk is in fact lower with that right package in parallel to the financing.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Before I move to another big topic, I would like you to reflect on the international cooperation and the reform of the international financial architecture. Can I just kind of conclude this part with one question? What do you think from the private companies' point of view, which of the points you have mentioned or we have mentioned are the most important? Is it the good governance and good regulatory framework? Is it the capacity to present bankable projects and to implement them? Is it the political understanding between the national and the local level? Can we find any preferential order among these points, or you think these are all very important? Mauricio? Or Karen?
I would say,
Sorry, just for clarification, are you talking about corporates or are you talking about investors?
Wow, I was thinking about the private sector banks, financial investors. Yes.
Okay, yeah. Mauricio, go ahead.
I would say all of the above.
Yeah.
All of the above. I mean, all of those are really important. You cannot attract private sector investment without proper regulatory frameworks. You know, I would say that, interestingly, I found that there's actual appetite from the private sector to invest more in sustainable urban infrastructure, for example, which is fundamental. I think that this is, by the way, a topic we should be discussing further because, you know, given the pace of urbanization around the world, given the fact, like Karen mentioned, that, you know, by the year 2050 will be more than 70% of the world's population living in cities, of course, the world will need more and more urban infrastructure, which, by the way, we should develop it under sustainability criteria. So given the pace of that rapid urbanization and given how much more urban infrastructure will be needed, it is estimated that the world witness the development of the whole of New York City's infrastructure once per month from now until 2050. That's the massive amount of new urban infrastructure that the world will be developing. The question is how are we going to finance it, okay? Clearly, public money will never be enough. We need to bring the private sector in. And therefore, regulatory frameworks are fundamental. Clear regulatory frameworks, stability on regulations like Karen mentioned. Very importantly, stable tax systems, because that very frequently, if you don't have that, that discourages the private sector to step in. But also, I think you have to work on the supply side of the equation in terms of, you know, cities should be ready to develop properly planned projects and to listen and understand what the private sector is looking for. Again, I found there's a divorce between city officials and the private sector. They don't understand each other. They are not speaking the same language. We need to develop spaces for mutual understanding. Because if we keep playing this game on, you know, everybody working in silos, then cities will keep developing projects that may look very nice on paper, but will never become attractive for private sectors to invest in. So that's very important. That's why it is very important to hear the private sector from the design stage of projects. I think that's really, really important. And be creative. I think that one avenue that deserves deeper exploration is that of how to channel finance for urban projects through utility companies or special purpose vehicles, because that lifts away some of the burden that cities have when they are the ones directly accessing finance. So again, I think that there's a lot of potential in there. There are already international finance institutions that are very open to support utility companies directly without the need of a sovereign guarantee. For example, the city of Quito, when I was mayor, we got a credit from the French Development Agency for our water and sanitation utility company without a sovereign guarantee. And I can hear international finance institutions are more and more open to that kind of alternatives, which I think could be worth exploring and worth enhancing.
And maybe I can just add also an example. So last year we had, so at Building Bridges at the conference, one thing we do is exactly showcasing how these different sectors need to work together in order to develop these solutions. And in fact, Swiss Rock, which is, so this is not an example from Switzerland, but nonetheless, I think it's really relevant. The Swiss Rock is a real estate developer in Switzerland. And they describe basically, they basically put together a panel showcasing how different sectors had to work together in Switzerland from the national side, but then also from the canton, from the cities, from the regulatory side to really say, what do we want to achieve also in terms of climate resilience? What are our guidelines, our regulatory frameworks, our climate policies for the cities, what we need to achieve? Once that was clear, based on that, private sector could properly implement or basically develop the standards needed for construction, for new construction, but also for renovations. And that really provided new investment opportunities. And this is what the private sector is interested in. So in terms of energy efficient construction, in terms of smart building technologies, that also fosters innovation, being clear about carbon reduction targets. And that then was then mobilizing private investments. And one group of investors who are very active in that field are the pension funds. So you talk to, if you look at the portfolio of those pension funds that are very active in sustainable finance, a big part of that goes into real estate because it's something very concrete and tangible that can be invested in, that has a lot of value and provides the returns that private investors have to look for, and it's the mandate they have to fulfill. And I think that's maybe a second point. So there's no difference in that sense about what's required in Switzerland versus what's required in Ecuador or in South Africa, anywhere. That collaboration needs to work. And the second level, what we hear often from the bigger international investors to say, where is the local money? So mobilizing in order to gain trust of larger international investors and to mobilize funding, it's also necessary to mobilize local private investments. And for example, pension funds, there are pension funds obviously in South Africa, I mean in different countries, and to say how can they get engaged and how can they also invest from the private side into these kind of infrastructure projects, into urban development, creates a lot of trust with international organizations, private or public, and that local knowledge that is necessary and that local oversight that is necessary to provide the transparency and the local knowledge that somebody in Switzerland, a Swiss investor, will not have. But if they have a local partner who's willing to put his own money in there, they will go along. So I think that's also an important, let's say, collaboration that you have to have cross geographies to make to mobilize investments, especially for the development agenda.
Excellent. Thank you very much for these insights. And the time is running very quickly, so I would switch to my second part of the questions, given that we are focusing on the Financing for Development conference. And my question would be how, because we hear a lot from the UN circles, or also from some member states as well, that we need to reform the international financial architecture. But of course, reform at the international level, the national level, and the local level might mean different things. How do you see what would needed at the international level, at the global level? What are the aspects of the international financial architecture which should be modified to make it more perhaps effective, perhaps more inclusive to local sustainable urban projects, or as partners, the local and regional governments themselves? Maurizio, you mentioned the utility companies. That's one way. Do you see a possibility to open up the system more towards local and regional government? or what other aspects you think is most important to look at and to listen to in Sevilla? Perhaps Mauricio, if you.
I think the first step is to actually, for the international finance institutions, for national governments, and for international organizations, to start recognizing the key role that local governments play in implementing global agendas, and therefore to become financially autonomous and strengthen their capabilities in order to play the role that they need to play effectively in order to meet these global agendas. I think that if we don't recognize that local governments should become financial subjects per se, we are in a big problem. I think that we need to realize, again, that we live in a highly urbanized world, and that, for example, cities are absolutely pivotal in anything we want to do regarding global agendas, but we need for these institutions and this place to understand the wide array of difficulties that cities are confronting when accessing finance, which are very different. You know, the reality that African cities face is very different to the one that Latin American cities face and the one that European. But in general, there's a problem, and we need to understand the particularities of that problem and understand as well that the only way that we could address this challenge is by working together, by fostering vertical integration, multi-level government collaboration to make the necessary regulatory reforms that countries need in order to empower cities and local governments to access finance in a better way. That's number one. Number two, on the part of international organizations, it is fundamental, it is urgent to develop new direct financial facilities for cities, new direct financial facilities for cities. There are already some very good examples of IFIs doing this. For example, the EBRD launched the Green Cities program, which is channeling funds to cities without the need of a sovereign guarantee, and has been very successfully doing so. I think this is the kind of examples other institutions should follow. And in general, to realize that we need to embark ourselves in a gradual process to develop a whole new institutionality for local government finance. We can start by developing certain instruments, certain mechanisms like a guarantee fund or like X, Y, and Z direct financial facilities. Those are important steps, but at the end, we need to pursue a pathway towards creating a new institutionality for local government finance. There are some ideas out there in this regard. For example, back in 2019, C40, OEDI, and others proposed the creation of a Green Cities Development Bank, like a World Bank for cities. I think it's maybe bold at this point, but I think it's worth discussing and exploring this kind of disruptive changes that probably are the ones needed if we really want to create change. And remember, the clock is ticking. We don't have too much time, so we should be doing this fast.
Thank you. Karen.
So I'll come in from the different perspective of how to move private capital, and especially from, I would say now from, let's say, the North. So looking a lot at the European and the American pension funds. By the way, the Asian pension funds are also getting the institutional asset owners, basically, because this is, I think, on the private side where you find the largest investment sources, right? And for me, always to say we have the multilateral banks, they are important, but how do we get the even bigger amount of private funding in there? And I do think there's a big regulatory issue also in terms of prudential regulation, where basically low middle income countries are very generically treated in a way in terms of how they can, what capital reserves are needed for banks, for institutional investors to preserve. And this is for insurance companies, but also for pension funds, for banks. We talk about Basel III or talk about the Solvency Act. And I think there's treating non-OECD countries very similarly, and that incurs basically then high borrowing costs for them, makes these projects, even on a country level, already incredibly expensive, and we're not even talking about cities. A lot of that hinges on rating. And usually that rating is provided by the large international rating agencies. And de-risking mechanisms are not really taken into account. So if we talk about blended finance vehicle, for example, that's being applied, even that blending, although it is de-risking a vehicle, is not taken into account when we talk about prudential regulation and capital reserves, capital requirements that are implemented. That is something that doesn't make sense. It doesn't do justice to the real risk that a financial instrument really has. And so that is something that certainly should be adjusted. That sounds a bit technical, but practically it's a massive issue because we talk about these high borrowing costs of low middle income countries, different countries because of the high perceived risk, but because of that generic, let's say, approach in how to assess that risk. That is something that is real and that the banks and basically institutional asset owners also have to comply with. So that is something I think in Sevilla that's also being discussed. In fact, that prudential framework should change and should be much more granular to really assess the real risk. The other thing, Mauricio, you were alluding to was in fact that a lot of basically, if you look at the default rates of cities, they are lower than the corporate default rates. There's also a big difference if you look at normal corporate debt versus project debt, for example, of long-term infrastructure debt. So having much more granularity in that and really understanding it is important, but it does require that international regulation, that prudential regulation moves away from this very, let's say, black and white approach and very simplistic approach and becomes much more granular and basically takes data from governments, from cities, from basic credit agencies that are existing in countries, from private providers like insurance companies who have a lot of data, the banks have a lot of data, and really assesses the real risk. That would go far away on having that perceived risk and the regulatory framework and the obligations on that being removed, and then really pricing projects and investments according to the real risk. And that should lower the borrowing cost for cities, for individual projects, for countries significantly.
Thank you very much. That's something very practical. And I would like to ask both of you something similarly practical as my last question. But before I do so, in the chat, there is one question to Mauricio. Could you elaborate on the Green Cities Guarantee Fund a little bit more? So I would ask you, Mauricio, in 2 minutes to give some more info, and then ask you, Karen, and once again, Mauricio, to give us, Global Cities Hub and local governments who will participate in Sevilla, one advice, what you think would be the most important thing to focus on. So let's start with the Green Cities Guarantee Fund, Mauricio.
Very quickly, the Green Cities Guarantees Fund is aimed at supporting the development on urban climate resilient infrastructure projects by working together with cities, with municipally owned utility companies, or with the private sector investing in urban projects. The idea of this Guarantees Fund is to de-risk this kind of operations and to foster the deployment of more and more capital into urban infrastructure. The Green Cities Guarantees Fund is being structured as we speak. We have been having conversations, for example, with the Green Climate Fund to potentially receive their support for the project preparation phase of the project. We are thinking about developing, even though this is a global initiative, we're thinking about developing a Latin American pilot for the Green Cities Guarantees Fund, for which CAF, the Latin American Development Bank, has expressed interest in hosting the Latin American pilot of the Green Cities Guarantees Fund. So we're working very hard on making this possible as soon as possible. Ideally, we will have some exciting news at COP30, so stay tuned.
Thank you very much. So last word and recommendation for us, Karen.
I would say it's something Mauricio was alluding to, and we basically have baked in as building bridges. You do build bridges. Whenever you plan, incorporate basically in that planning progress, already listen to all the different stakeholders. If you want to get private investment in there, you need to have them around the table in the planning period. listen to their concerns, listen to their requirements and the expectations, and that is how you can co-create these projects, these investments. Same goes for multilaterals. Once you bring these stakeholders together from the beginning, you will be much more successful, and then basically co-creating a structure that will work for all sides and where you can really then maximize the investment and the result of that. And that would really be my mantra.
Thank you very much. I took note of, and I will try my best to use it.
Good luck.
Mauricio, what would be your 1 point?
I think that we need to come up with concrete initiatives on what kind of reforms do we want to see at the global financial architecture to make it more local government friendly. Again, I think that we should embark ourselves on an ambitious institutional reform mechanism by which we develop these concrete mechanisms as a first step in order to make sure that the voices from local governments are being heard and that they become financially empowered to access finance in a timely, in affordable way, and recognizing on part of national governments and international organizations that they cannot do it alone. They need local governments to achieve the high ambition of our current global agendas.
Thank you very much. I couldn't tell it brighter and more compact. So with those notes at the end, I would like to thank our two excellent speakers, Karen Hitchke from Building Bridges and Mauricio Rodas from the SDSN. And all those who participated could find in the chat a lot of links to both our organizations as well as to ours. So let's keep up the conversation. Once again, thank you very much for your time, for your insights, and we are looking forward to work together, Karen, Mauricio. Thank you and goodbye.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Bye.
Bye.